All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Kevin Ring with FAM, and we're back with another edition of our Heart to Heart series. Today is one I've been looking forward to for a while. We're going to talk about who deserves a second chance. And I think everyone's inclination is to say that everybody deserves a second chance, or at least that's the popular thing to say. But I think if we search our hearts, we find that there are some people we just really don't want to forgive. And yesterday was my 12th anniversary at FAM, and I've been doing this work for a while. And the more people I encounter, they realize that folks who are in this space have the same biases as people who are not in this space. Some of the most dedicated advocates for criminal justice reform, I find, also have the same biases about types of people or types of offenses they have trouble forgiving. And even people with loved ones in prison, I find are quick to opt out or compare their situation in a way that makes their loved ones seem less culpable or less bad. And I can't believe my loved one got this when that really evil person got that. And that impulse, that sort of desire to other somebody exists among all of us. And I think even in the culture today, if you go on social media, or don't, for your own benefit, you probably shouldn't. But that impulse to cancel others and to, the mob justice of just harming somebody who says the wrong thing or thinks the wrong thing is different in the sense of nobody's imprisoned for that. And so it's not the same as incarceration. But that impulse to judge and condemn, that retributive impulse that I'm going to show how virtuous I am by condemning the others, is the same one that has led, I think, to a lot of the long sentences and punitive laws that we see in our criminal justice system. Because no one, if you listen to Senator Tom Cotton, he says, I'm on the side of law abiding, not the criminals. And that's the big, that's a big net. And so I want to explore that question. I just mentioned that at FAM, we once had a staff meeting. We went around the room and I said, who do you have who's your bias against? What's the class of offender or offense that you have the least sympathy for? And about halfway through, someone on our staff said, well, this is a very unFAM thing to do because we oppose mandatory minimums for any crime. And of course, that's true. But to deny that we don't have biases and instincts that lead us to condemn some people more than others is a mistake. Because we do. And we found even in our group, there were some people who are worried about people who use a gun, other people who are repeat offenders. Some people don't like white collar offenders. And it's not to say we don't fight for all those people, but you need to check your own bias so that you can do this work better and you can catch yourself. And so we wanted to have that discussion. And so to have it, I wanted to invite some of the people who are the most likely to be condemned because of the offenses they committed. And so I thought that would be an interesting way to check our own biases and decide, do we really believe in second chances for everybody? So as always, there's always technical glitches when we do Facebook Lives. We're having a little one because Tyrone's had a power issue, but he looks like he's there now. So I'm going to start with him. And Tyrone, if you can tell us a little bit about your interaction with the legal system, what you were charged with, and that experience.
Oh, good afternoon. Thank you, Kevin. Can everyone hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, thank you. I was 17 years old. I didn't plan on this crime. My cousin got killed. I had to identify his body. He got killed that night. I had to identify his body about 7 a.m. the next morning. I was with his sister, and she told me that she could do it. She was in her late 20s. It is, I'm just a teen. She was like, you have to do it. So I identified his body, one of the worst things I've ever done in my life, one of them. And about 4 or 5 hours later, I fired a gun that took another human's life. A lot of times in life, people don't look at perpetrators as being victims, but victims are also perpetrators, and perpetrators are also victims. As I started that, I didn't plan on waking up saying that this was going to be my day. I had no thoughts of these things were going to transpire in my life. they did. I accept my responsibility for my actions because I am responsible for what I've done. But I just never planned on this to happen.
And what were you charged with, Tyrone? What were you charged
And
with?
excuse me, I was charged with first-degree murder, premeditated murder, and conspiracy to commit murder.
And what was your sentence?
My original sentence was 127 years and 8 months to life.
And why are you here today? How did you get out?
Well, I got out because DC passed a law called the Incarceration Reduction Amendment Act, which essentially said if you committed a crime before your 18th birthday and have served at least 20 years at the time, now it's 15, you can be considered for early release, which is essentially a second chance at life.
Yeah. Well, listen, I'm going to come back to you, but I want to get everybody's story in, and then we're going to delve into these a little bit more. So, Morgan, can you just share a little bit about your story and why you were selected today?
Yeah. So, after high school, maybe a couple of years, me and all my friends started using OxyContin. And specifically, like me and my friend Justin, we really got into OxyContin, and then it got really, really expensive, and we switched to using heroin. I was addicted to heroin, ended up injecting heroin for years, and I tried to keep it together. I tried to still go to work and deliver pizza and buy heroin with my tips, but the system was stacked against me on that. And eventually, I would be couch surfing homeless and just trying to come up with enough money for heroin that day. And I lived like that for years, just flat broke, buying a half gram of heroin a day. And then my mom died, and I got her veterans group life insurance payment. And so for the first time, I was able to buy more than just, 8 hours worth of heroin. And so I had a few grams of heroin, and Justin, my friend that I'd been using with for years and years, he called me and he was looking for a gram, and I sold him a gram of heroin out of my bag. And, I took his $80, and he went home to his apartment, and he overdosed and died alone in his apartment. And the next day, my apartment was raided by the police, and I was charged with distribution of heroin resulting in death.
And what was the prison time you were facing?
That specific charge carries a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence. And I was pled out to a lesser charge of conspiracy to distribute heroin and given a sentence of 5 years.
And so you did 5 years in federal prison?
Yeah, 4.5 years in BOP custody. Mm-hmm.
And because a lot of people here watch this, where did you serve your time?
So I took 2 years to get sentenced. So I spent 2 years in county jail in Portland, Oregon, and then I did 2 years at FCI Dublin. Okay. It's in Alameda County, Oakland, California, because there are no women's federal prisons in Oregon.
Yeah. All right, and we're going to come back. So, Guy, can you share your overview of your story with us?
Yeah. Okay. Sure. Yeah. So, good afternoon, everyone. My story, I guess, it really begins back in my childhood, and I come to the work that I do now very honestly, for a variety of reasons. But so when I was 8 years old, I was the victim of a rape, and that changed my childhood in a number of ways that I think it probably does typically for kids. But prior to that, I was pretty happy-go-lucky. But after that, I really struggled with mood issues and also being bullied in school pretty severely. And so I was amongst the first generations to grow up with computers and the internet. I don't know how old I look exactly, but I'm 36. So I was that first generation growing up with America Online. And I found a lot of safety in that environment and in my room with the internet, and I didn't have to sort of be outside where things were scary. And I, like most teenage boys, I became, pretty involved, I guess you'd say, with internet pornography. And my relationship with internet pornography became pretty compulsive and pretty problematic, such that I essentially would download everything I came across. And when I was about 16 years old, I came across what you'd refer to as child pornography, images that were not legal. And at the time, they were, people who were about my age, but I knew sort of dimly that it was wrong. But I just continued to download those images along with everything else. And that went on for a couple of years until I was 22. And I was living with my girlfriend at the time. And she found an email on my computer from a woman I'd been having an affair with. And then she went looking through my computer to see what else I was hiding and lying about. And she found this, enormous stash of pornography, and some of which was not legal. And she went to the police. And so what happened that day is I was arrested, taken into custody. And ironically, the freest that I ever felt was in an interrogation room, handcuffed and surrounded by detectives who were asking me questions. And I cooperated, and I was finally able to get honest. And I can go into more of my story later, but
Yeah.
but the charge that I faced was, possession. It was a state charge. It was possession of material depicting a sexual performance by a minor, and it was prosecuted in state court. But it ultimately, led me to the work that I do now. And I didn't have to go to because it stayed in state court as opposed to being charged federally, which could have happened. I didn't have to go to prison because if it had gone federal, then I would have faced a mandatory minimum sentence. But so instead of going to prison, I got to go to law school, which I guess is just a prison of another kind. But that's the general overview of my story. And
Well, let's talk about this, because I think some people who think they show great compassion really are showing compassion to people who haven't harmed anyone, or at least in their mind haven't harmed anyone. And so, I always say FAM is not the Innocence Project. Everybody at FAM did it. And so we're the opposite of that. But what we're getting at is, if you've caused harm, what's the proportional punishment? If there's punishment at all, is there another way to hold people accountable? That's another discussion. But I want to talk about this, not to rub your nose in it, and we've talked ahead of time, this is not my goal, but just to be as real as possible. I went to prison, caused harm. So can we just talk a little bit about the harm that the offenses cause, so that people realize that you're not asking to be absolved of, this isn't, I had possession of marijuana and I really didn't hurt anybody. Most crimes, or a lot of crimes, people are harmed, and we still want second chances for them. So let's just talk about that. Tyrone, I know, we did a video with you where you talked about it's a day you regret, but I don't think, I think that your age is a mitigating factor, but you wouldn't say you're not responsibility for causing great harm to somebody. So can you talk a little bit about that?
There's not a day that, even today, is not a day that I don't think about what I've done and how deeply sorry I am for what I've done. And not paying respect to the harm that you have done is like a slap in the face, because somebody was harmed. Not only somebody, a family was harmed, and a community was harmed. Not just one, but two. My victim's family and community was harmed, and my family was harmed, because they had to, in fact, endure 20 plus years of incarceration with me. And that's hard. And that's something that I can never take back. I can never take that back. So what I have done was rehabilitate my life and move my life forward to pay back, not for everything I've done, but just to be a better person for society at large, and paying back that way and being a different person, a different role model, so people can look and see that, hey, This guy made a mistake, but look at him. Look at him today. Look at what he's doing. Look how he's helping people. Look how he's changing the face of what we say our criminal justice reform. And this is a part of it.
Well, you're an advocate now, and you're doing great work at Justice Policy Institute. And I mean, you know, you're a perfect example of second chances, but I not only know people, I have people in my family who would say, you took a life, eye for an eye, you know, great that you were rehabilitated, but that person didn't get a second chance. What do you say?
I tell them that they're right, and they have every right to feel that way. And that, as I stated, that I can't change what I've done. I can't go back in time. All I can do is just move forward and be the man that I am today.
Yeah, actually, I should, because people aren't going to know you. Can you tell people what you're doing today?
Oh, well, today I'm associate at the Justice Policy Institute, and we do research on prison reform issues. I mean, throughout the nation, and throughout the world, or globe, as I like to say. And then based on our findings, we report to the media, lawmakers, advocates, and the public on best practices of those programs.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, we've worked together, and I appreciate that. I don't know that everybody would know that, but I mean, you're making the most of the second chance. And so I just wanted to at least signal that. Morgan, who'd you hurt? And what was the harm you caused? And how should people reconcile that? Oh, you're muted, I think.
You know, for me, that's a bigger question. I did sell that gram to Justin, and that is what killed him. But I see in the police report, and I could see that he was texting multiple dealers trying to get heroin. So if I wouldn't have sold it to him, would he have got it from someone else? Probably. Would that dose have killed him? Maybe. I can never know that. But our struggle with the drug war, you know, went years before this. And really it was the government and police that set the tone. So the first time I overdosed, I was a kid. I was 18, 19 years old. My boyfriend called 911 to save my life. So the paramedics came to revive me with naloxone, and they arrested him. This is before the Good Samaritan law. So they arrested him, charged him with felony possession of heroin. He was immediately terminated from his job, and the police voluntarily forwarded a copy of the arrest report to our landlords at the apartment, and we were evicted or asked to leave, and we were homeless. And so that was like my introduction to the drug war. And so Justin was right there. In fact, that night I had bought the heroin from him. So this dichotomy between, you know, buyer and seller, that's not real. I was buying and selling heroin from my friends because we were all trying to survive and to avoid dope sickness. So yes, I did take a part in Justin's death, and I regret that, and I have nightmares about it. What if I just wouldn't have answered my phone? Would my friend that I loved dearly still be alive today? And I struggle with that. But the drug war system created these just very messy and complicated dynamics that hurt both Justin and I. In the year before his death and my arrest, he was sentenced to prison. I was incarcerated for possession 5 times. So I had been just cycled in and out of jail. So in those moments, our possession of heroin we were being held completely legally liable, to the point that we were literally being put in jail for our drug use. Justin was put in prison. But then the moment he died is the first moment the government decides his life had value. And then they invested millions of dollars in prosecuting me and my co-defendants and sentenced us to a grand total of 60 years in prison for his death. Where were those resources when he was alive? Why did we have to wait until he died to value his life?
Mm-hmm. Those who will seek retribution a lot of times will do so in the grounds of the victim's name. Your situation, I don't think, is that uncommon, that drugs are shared among people, and you know that line between user and dealer is very blurry. something I would have known until I did this work. But you have a victim in the sense of the victim's mother, and I just think that's interesting for people to understand. What was her take on this as you were prosecuted?
Yeah, so she watched her son struggle with addiction for years, and she knew me. We knew each other. I would spend time with their family. And out of all the friends that Justin made in the drug scene, they liked me best. I don't know how to phrase that. Because I did. I went to work and I bought my drugs with the money I'd earned at work. And so I was able to like maintain one foot in the normal world and try so hard to maintain the semblance of a normal life. And his mom respected me for that and liked that I would spend time with Justin because, he had a broken heart. We're using drugs because we have internal pain. We have this emotional pain that we're trying to cover up. And so she knew me. And when he first died and I first got prosecuted, I wasn't able to, talk to her at first. And I was agonizing over what she was going to think. Is she going to blame me? Does she think I killed her son? And then, I got some letters in jail from them. They wrote letters to the judge, and his mom spoke at my sentencing. And no, she said her son died of a broken heart. He died of his addiction. And to, punish me for that was not the path. It was not what she wanted. She did not see that as fair. And so she always showed me incredible compassion and support because, mind you, Justin's death was 3 months after my mom's overdose death. And so it was really just piled on. But I'm so fortunate in the compassion and love that she showed me. I would say she gave me forgiveness, but she didn't even see anything to forgive. And so she wrote me the whole time I was in prison. She wrote me yesterday. We talk all the time. And she's just been constantly supportive. Her biggest thing is, she was taught to give tough love, just like my mom, where if we're using kick them out, tough love, tough love. And so we actually did a podcast together about our perspectives. And she just says, love is not tough. Love is compassion. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. I mean, I've seen cases like that before. I've seen cases where the, victim's family wants vengeance, and so it can go either way. I'm happy that worked out for you. Guy, I want you to talk about harm caused, because in the area of child pornography, even when there's not contact offenses, when it comes to sex offenses, you hear a lot of talk about by even consuming it, you're contributing to a trade for it. And that consumption leads to more production of it. And so you are indirectly hurting somebody. So I want you to talk about harm. And somebody asked a question already, because I gotta be honest with people, child pornography is an offense that we hear more and more about at FAM. 20, 30 years ago, it was crack, and people were calling in and talking about these sentences. Child pornography is sort of this quiet thing that's happening across the country where families are not aware that their loved one is, seeing this or trading it or whatever. And then they're getting these incredible sentences for it. And it's so much shame and stigma that comes with it. And they're being prosecuted at the federal level where he's threatened. So why weren't you charged federally? Do you know? I mean, was there something that happened that made your case unique?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I guess to take that question first, I don't know exactly. I mean, I do know that the images that I had downloaded, they didn't involve sex acts. There was nudity, which, I mean, that still qualifies under the law. And I think that perhaps the nature of the images meant that the Department of Justice didn't necessarily want to allocate resources to prosecuting me. And like I said, I cooperated fully with investigators. So I think that, perhaps they were doing me, they were meeting me halfway by prosecuting me in state court, but I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I just really don't know. I also had parents who, were there for me from the word go, and they hired an attorney for me. And I don't know if it was the attorney who helped keep it in state court as opposed to it going federally. So it could be, it could be any number of those things. And as far as harm is concerned, I mean, even though, like I said, the images that I had, they didn't involve sex acts, but I don't think that necessarily means that like there was no harm or that I didn't have some sort of price to pay, because I mean, I think that I contributed even indirectly to other people's suffering and other people's pain, and it was pain that, you know, I knew personally from my own experiences as a child. And you know, I think it's right to be held accountable for that, for harm that you caused. And it certainly wasn't for me to say like what the right sentence was. And the way that I resolved to do that was to go into court on sentencing day. And I ended up pleading guilty to one count of possession. And it was an open plea agreement. There was no agreement as to what the judge was going to do. So the judge could send me to prison for 5 years. And in fact, that was what the Commonwealth attorney wanted. And that was also what the, you know, I know in federal court as well as in many state courts, you go through a pretrial interview process where the probation and parole will make a recommendation to the judge as to an appropriate sentence. And they also agreed. They said, well, because the nature of the offense, that, you know, the maximum sentence is warranted. So I went into court thinking, okay, I'm probably not coming home tonight. And the judge, and I resolved myself to accept whatever the punishment was going to be. And that was my way, because I had no way of knowing who I had harmed or how I could make amends to them. And the way I resolved to do that was I'm going to accept whatever punishment is imposed. And I'm going to go through that and do everything that's asked of me and not give anyone any trouble. And so if that meant prison, then I was going to do everything that was asked of me and do it with a mindset of, this is how I'm able to try to make some sort of amends. And the judge didn't give me a prison sentence, you know, gave me probation. So I, you know, attended every meeting with my probation officer and did everything that he, that he asked of me. But so that was the way that I resolved to try to be accountable for my conduct. Because again, I think that it was important that I be held accountable. I think it's important for anyone who causes harm to be held to account. And what I mean by being accountable is to be able to tell the truth about what you did, and to be able to take ownership of that and to commit to change. And that's why I say that I'm actually really grateful for my arrest. I'm actually, there's a long story. Like I said, my girlfriend was the one who my girlfriend at the time was the person who turned me into the police. We're still friends today. I actually talked to her a couple days ago. Like, I think I don't have any ill will towards her at all. I think she did the right thing. I think she did, she saved my life in many ways.
What people are going to say, and how old were you when you were sentenced to probation?
When I was arrested, I was 22.
Okay.
When I was arrested.
And we talked about what Tyrone's doing. Can you just mention, I know you just passed the bar exam. What are you doing now, so people know that they're
So the work that I do now, I work in sexual violence prevention policy. So I'm the legal fellow for the Sex Offense Litigation and Policy Resource Center at the Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, which is just so many, it's a lot of words. But the work that we do is, at the intersection of civil rights. So we focus on sex offense registries and indefinite civil confinement. And we advocate for better policy proposals for how we prevent and how we respond to sexual violence in America. That's the very quick intro for the work that I do now.
Well, so first, let me just stop and say thank you. I mean, we talked ahead of time and I knew your stories, but it's incredibly moving to have you share these, with people you don't know in sort of this format. And so I'm grateful for that. And we've talked about harm. So let's talk about the repair. Because I don't think anyone denies culpability. I don't think anyone talks about that they didn't deserve to be held accountable or punished and whatever that was. Let's talk about proportionality and what punishment looks like. a lot of us are working on legislation that like what was able to work for Tyrone, which is second look laws, which would allow people to serve a certain sentence and then have an opportunity to get back into court. Of course, we'd rather repeal mandatory minimums so people don't get these excessive sentences in every case. But I guess I want to ask, and start with you, Tyrone. You know, I don't think you would have said I shouldn't have not only been held accountable and punished, I should have gone to jail and prison. But at what point did you say, I got this? I got the message. I'm not that person anymore. And I think I could be more productive outside. And I'm not, I shouldn't be a concern to the public.
What kept me started, like I said before, I should have been held accountable. And I was, I was in college at the time at Allegheny College, and I was going into my 10th or 11th year of incarceration. But when I got to like 25, 26, the light bulb came on. And I was like, wow, I was like, I wasn't confused anymore. I knew exactly what I wanted to do with my life. At this time, I was heavily in fitness. So I am a certified personal trainer along with my day job. That just became crystal clear to me. Like, life wasn't confused. I wasn't confused with life anymore. And I knew what I wanted to do with my life. I had never felt like that until I got in my 20s. And that's what was so confusing to me. Like, why I had to wait to get in my 20s to start like thinking like this and feeling like this? Well, we know science today about neurobiology. So when I was in my mid-20s, and this light came on, and I started seeing like, man, I was 10, 11 years inside of my sentence, and I was thinking at the time that I was going to possibly die in one of those cells. And I was like, I'm just sitting here now, just wasting my life, because I have more to offer to the community now that I'm mature. So I was like 25, 26 years old when I realized that I could be somebody different and that I was someone different at that time.
Is that you're working now in this area? Isn't that consistent with what we see in sort of just people aging out of crime, and that crime sort of being a young man's game, and that, these long sentences aren't as effective because people do grow out of this?
Yes, and this is why we do this work in this area. And this is why I'm so easily to talk about it, because of my life experience. Now I'm like, oh man, I see now. I see everything, and it's so much different.
Did you feel like prison held you accountable? Like, one thing, when I was in prison and I saw the people there, I thought in some ways it allowed an escape from the harm that had been caused, as opposed to a confrontation with that harm that had been caused. It was easy to go work out and do things or read and not think, maybe I need to get my hands around, what I've done. When you were in prison, Tyrone, were there programming or were there opportunities, any kind of restorative justice, or even apart from that, just anything that allowed you to address the harm you'd caused, or were you just being warehoused as your punishment?
Well, at the time, I thought I was just being warehoused. Can you hear me?
We lost you.
There he is. I see him.
Yeah, we got you. Your sound was off.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. I'll come back to you. I'll come back to you. Let me ask Morgan that question. Morgan, it's like, when you were in prison,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know if you did drug treatment program, but I mean, was just like, I'm just going to pay this penalty and you're just going to put me in a box, or is this, I'm actually going to rehabilitate you?
I mean, no. So absolutely, it was punishment for the sake of punishment, which comes at the cost of rehabilitation. But I was able to do things in prison that most people aren't able to do, because when I got arrested, I still had a large portion of that life insurance settlement that was both, my demise and then later a benefit. So I was able to make unlimited phone calls and buy all the commissary I wanted. And I didn't have to develop a hustle to get my basic needs met. I wasn't stuck in survival mode in prison like most people. You're making $16 a month working at the kitchen, but a phone call costs $3.50. Get out. And so I was able to focus on myself. So from self-improvement, from getting into fitness, but then also what I found in prison. So like, I started thinking a lot about my addiction. I learned a lot about my own addiction, the dynamics of it. But most of all, overdose is a preventable death. And what's killing us is shame and stigma. Justin used alone in his room because he didn't want anyone else to know that he was using. And so I started thinking a lot about that, but then I got, I was awakened to justice, or better, the lack of justice in our system. And so I just started like tutoring GED, teaching little seminars, doing things, because I had 1 year of community college before I got arrested. And that made me one of the most educated people in the prison. And that's a travesty. That should not be. I had to teach people basic math, 2 + 2. And so I just saw like horrible systems failures of good human beings.
Yeah. Let me ask you this. So I'll jump into this pool and not play moderator. I went to prison for a white collar offense. And I remember when I got there, most of the guys, even though it was a camp, were there for drug crimes and gun crimes. And the guy said to me, "What an idiot you are." He's like, "You had it made." You had a good life and you screwed it up, right? And obviously it's more complicated than that. But one thing, because there's definitely, when we talked about bias, even in our office, especially if you have people who are over policed and worried about drug and gun crimes, you really hate the Bernie Madoffs and you hate the white collar offenders. That's where your bias is. But one thing that was interesting to me about being in prison was the people who were there for drug offenses, they were not all addicts. It was a hustle for some of them. They had jobs, they were teachers, or they had other jobs that didn't make a lot of money, and they wanted more money. And so I'm not saying that they were greedy, but it wasn't that different. That mentality wasn't that different in some of the white collar offenders that were there too, which is a very human nature. Like I have money, I want more money. And some of those lines can be blurry. And so I just think sometimes with the drugs, even our side will say, "Oh, it's all a product of addiction and, just out of your control." But sometimes it's just bad. It's greed, other very human impulses that lead people to do that. Was that your experience, or were you around all the addicts?
Me, no, that was not my experience. So I was at a FCI. But my FCI, because in the women's system, people with immigration holds do not go to a private prison. So about 40% of FCI Dublin is Mexican citizens that were not living in the United States. They had visas and they would cross the border in their car. So mostly middle-class Mexican university women. And then they would get enticed to cross drugs hidden in their vehicle. And then sometimes get incredibly long sentences for drugs, and they wouldn't even know like what quantity was in their car or what drug it was. They just like agreed. And so I saw a lot of that. But I wouldn't say that that's the same sort of greed, because now we're talking about global upside down economies where $3,000 US, is 6 months of full-time, 6-day-a-week brutal work in Tijuana, Mexico.
Understood.
Yeah, where I now live. So now like I'm living in Tijuana right now and doing harm reduction. So I'm doing naloxone distribution, syringe exchange, because overdose is a preventable death. But yeah, I saw a lot of that. And then the American citizens, it was mostly drug people with substance use disorders. And then so or there would be the violent crimes or gun possession that didn't have the same linkage with addiction.
Yeah.
But I saw very few professionals that at all.
Well, it's just one thing. I just remember being there, and I served time with a guy who was there for a sort of smaller Ponzi type scheme, and walking the track with him, over the course of a couple of weeks, I heard stories about childhood trauma that were no different than I heard from some of the people serving for drug offenses and gun offenses. And none of which is to excuse any of the, the ultimate behavior or excuse the harm. It's just to say that when people have this cartoonish idea that it's just some banker who's trying to steal money, some of that behavior is rooted in other things. And it sort of gets lost in this because these are people who we think, right? Oh, like the guy who said to me, oh, you had enough. So you shouldn't have had those bad impulses that some of us other have, because all we were trying to do was make the rent and you were, trying to get a vacation or something. Guy, what have you seen in terms of this, in terms of like whether the system we have now is making people better? Is it making us feel better? Because we do like to punish people. We do like to ostracize people. So what are we missing?
Well, I mean, I was fortunate in that I never went to prison, and so I didn't get to have that experience, which I'm certainly fortunate for. But I did then went to go work in criminal defense, and I got to see. I went to law school because I wanted to be a public defender, because I saw a lot of people going through the system that didn't have what I thought was adequate representation. And I asked my lawyer one day after a hearing, I was like, can you go to law school with felony conviction? He said, yeah, of course you can. So, I got to see up close and personal a lot of the ways in which, I think that, I think we generally as Americans care a lot about this idea of justice. And we care a lot about this idea of holding people accountable. But I'm not sure that's what, our systems that we have in place are actually very good at doing. I think we are extremely good in this country at punishing people, and then we're bad at knowing when or even how to stop. Because I think that justice without any kind of accountability or punishment is not really justice at all. But then I think where we have gone astray, generally speaking, is that we seem to have forgotten that it has to be counterbalanced with notions of proportionality and also the opportunity for redemption. And without those things, I think that punishment just becomes a poison, and it diminishes us all, not just the people who are, cast out of society and cast into prisons, but also victims of crime. Everyone. I think it diminishes us all society-wide when we forget those important principles, because I think I've seen it time and again that people change, and we have a system that doesn't recognize that, doesn't reward that.
But what do you say about? But people will say, I know what the recidivism numbers are. I mean, a lot of people who go to prison are likely to reoffend in the next, 3 to 6 years when they get out. So yeah, I know I'm gonna deny some of you a second chance, but I'm hedging my bets that keeping you in is gonna keep my family safer. Morgan, you're about to jump out of your seat to answer that one.
Yeah. So I think for all of us sitting on this panel, our crimes were committed in a specific context. Okay, so it was bound to a time and place and circumstance that we found ourselves in. Okay, and then we were sentenced to prison. But what prison is not good at doing is changing that context when we get out. So, you cite high recidivism. Well, let's look at why is that? What are the collateral consequences of a felony? Especially, me, someone in recovery, if I would have gotten out of prison to $0, I didn't have a state ID, I didn't have health insurance, they just kick you out. So I couldn't fill out my FAFSA because I was in prison in California, getting out to Oregon. There's absolutely no communication. If I would have got out with $0, I probably would have ended up back in prison. So, these things that are bound to time and place and context, these crimes, we have to consider that. And then when we move years away, because we've been in prison for years or whatever it is, so we are therefore removed from that context, and we could use a helping hand to change our environs and to change that context, so we never find ourselves in a situation where we are likely to commit crime again, because prison is not fun. No one wants to go back. No one gets out of prison and thinks, I'm going to go back to prison in 6 months. And so I think we should really look at our high recidivism not as a failure of people, but what these people that need more help are getting more barriers instead.
Yeah, I've heard conservative advocates say that any government program that has a failure rate that our prison rates have, you know, we'd want to abolish that program because it's failing at such a high rate. Let me ask you both. I'm not avoiding you, Tyrone, but this is a question you can't answer for obvious reasons. We're at a time when the country's wrestling with racial inequity in the system, and that's pretty clear that from policing to getting out, that those problems exist. Guy, you talked about being able to have an attorney and that assisted you. Now, child pornography offenses skew white, so I don't know that you're going to see a disparity in terms of offense rates and all that sort of stuff. But what do you, and then I'll ask you, Morgan, what have you seen in terms of racial inequity? How do you see it manifest itself? Is it true? I mean,
well, I mean, it is interesting. I mean, you know, when we talk about child pornography offenses, I think those offenses generally do skew white. But the work that I do is on, you know, sex offense registration.
yes.
That's a lot of the work that I do, which for people who don't know, it's essentially, you can think of it kind of like an extended form of probation or parole, but without any of the constitutional protections that come with probation or parole. And that does, you know, like any other aspect of the criminal legal system, that also has racial inequities. What research has shown is that people of color are overrepresented on registries, and also that you know, various states have mechanisms for classifying people based on, you know, they assign them into different tiers, which is supposed to be like, this tier is more risky or this tier is less risky, which you know, I'm not going to get on my soapbox about, but it's take it with a giant grain of salt. But also people of color are more likely to be classified into higher risk tiers, you know, because of things like, you know, more likely to have prior contacts with the criminal system, et cetera, et cetera. And if they're classified into higher tiers, that means generally more onerous conditions and longer periods of registration. And I've also mentioned that I work on, you know, indefinite civil commitment of people convicted of sex offenses, which again, for people who don't know, is just essentially taking someone's imprisonment and extending it indefinitely, and doing it in a way that we can kind of squint at it and call it constitutional. But I've also seen some data very recently that I can't attribute at this point, but there's also, again, racial disparities when it comes to that process as well. So yeah, I think just generally speaking, if you're talking about any aspect of the criminal legal system, including when we're talking about sex offenses, then that's also going to impact, you know, when we're talking about racial justice. And then the final point that I'll say about this is that because I mean, I work in sexual violence, you know, prevention. It isn't really just about saying that, well, these things are violations of people's constitutional rights, et cetera, I mean, which they are. But it's also about how do we prevent, you know, what's the way we want to go about preventing sexual violence? And the way that we have our laws have sexual violence framed as kind of like how we understand sexual violence is that we, like, if you look at all like the named laws, like, you know, Megan's Law, Jessica's Law, like it's all framed as like a white problem, and it kind of submerges sexual violence in communities of color, and also particularly in you know, Native communities where sexual violence is actually experienced at a much higher rate than in amongst white communities. So I think that there are, when we're talking about sexual violence and sex offenses, there's a lot of different things that we can talk about when it comes to racial justice.
Morgan.
I mean, I've said it before, I'll say it again. If I was Black, I would still be in prison today. So the average sentence for my crime for a person of color is 8 years. And I only got out 1.5 years ago. So I would actually still be in prison, but it's not as reductionist to say the judge saw my white skin and gave me a lower sentence. No. When people, you know, speak of it in that terms, it's So like, let's trace it back. My grandmother graduated with a bachelor's degree in 1944. Okay, and so then and then my mom served 20 years in the military. She didn't get kicked out for being gay, even though it was illegal to be gay. She was white, you know. And then because she was in the military, then I joined the Air Force. So I've got, you know, veteran plates on my car. So between, you know, I had almost 4 years of heroin addiction before my first arrest. That would never happen if I was in like an over policed community or if I didn't have white skin. And then in prison too, I was treated better by the guards. And again, I don't think it's as simple as they saw my white skin, but we spoke the same language.
Morgan, I say this, I said this all the time.
Yeah.
That was totally my experience.
Right. So I spoke the same language as the oppressors because I have this like, you know, semi-academic, articulate, nerdy manner of speech that I learned from my mother, who learned from her mother. And that's how the prison guard spoke. So I would have to help people with like, especially in jail, with their medical requests. They're telling me what their medical problem is. But if they wrote that on the paper, then the triage nurse is going to throw it away, even though their problem is there, but we're not speaking in the same dialect of English and one is not respected. And so I would have to take what they were saying and then write it in proper academic English, just so these people could get the medical care they deserved and were asking for.
Can I just tell you something about that? You saying that just makes me crazy about one point I want to say. At FAM, we're always trying to elevate the voices of those who are directly impacted, right? And some of that is, you know, people share their stories directly, or sometimes we'll work with them on op-eds and stuff. The op-eds that some of the folks who have been in prison for 20, 30 years would write would not get printed in any of our elite newspapers. They don't want to hear those voices. We will get those sent back to straighten out run-on sentences and grammar and syntax. And so I just think that bias is almost an overeducation bias of everybody talks like this if you want to be heard. And that's not how a lot of the folks we work with, black or white, talk. Mm-hmm. And yet we have to dress it up to make it compelling. But it's just it's one of those things. It's a small place where I think bias creeps in. You know, Tyrone, I can't imagine life would have been that much easier for you on your charges if you had been white. But what did you see in the system? I bet you didn't see, you would have probably didn't serve with a lot of white people. So what did you see?
I saw groves of black and brown people. White was sprinkled in between. Asians. I mean, what I like to say is that I was incarcerated with some international criminals. Remember, I went inside the BOP November the 7th, 1995. I stayed in the BOP from 1995 to 2017. So I stayed in the BOP for over 20 years, and I know what that was like. And as Morgan pointed out, I can't tell you how many people I tutored. I've had cellies I had to tutor to help get GEDs. I got to
interrupt you, Tyrone, on this part because it didn't come out that well in the video. When you went to prison, I mean, how well could you read or write?
Oh, I do the tab test at education. And I look back, they said my reading and comprehensive was a 3.8. What happened? I met somebody while I was there. Somebody who was a black man who taught me how to read and write. Then I wind up going to college because of him. I got my GED because of him. Then I wind up going to college because of him. So I had somebody to help me. And all of my professors were white coming in from Allegheny College.
I'm just saying that I just think people don't think, I mean, you went in, you know, it's not, you look, when I went in, I was like, okay, I'm going to bring some books. I'm going to catch up on reading, right? You went in not knowing how to read. And I just think it's such a different and amazing level of skill elevation to get to that point. Like you weren't going to, you were thinking I'm going to be in here forever. And your first thought instead is I'm going to educate myself. I just think people would not think that way about people going to prison generally, and certainly for the crime you committed. So it's just an amazing thing. And in our video view, it just sort of, all of a sudden you're talking about reading, but it was clear that that's not something you did before you went. And how did you do college? How'd you do college? Because one thing, you know, we've talked about, and you guys all know, is restoring Pell Grants for people who were incarcerated, because that was taken away in the for a crime bill, and so it's harder for people to pursue education. So how did you do it, Tyrone?
Well, the Pell Grant still exists then.
Oh yeah, you've been there so long.
So actually, when they took the Pell Grants, they kicked us all out of college. They kicked us out, like,
Yeah.
because they wasn't coming back in. But to like have that experience, even being incarcerated, right? To have 4 classes a week and working in Unicorn. So like Morgan was saying, like I was around different people, like hey, no, we're not in the street, we're not hustling, we're not selling drugs. So Unicorn was the new hustle. This is how we framed it, to give everybody to understand, like you still gotta support yourself and take care of yourself like you did out in the community. But you had to do it in the legal way. So we worked Unicorn. So I would work Unicorn from 7:30 a.m. to 3:30 p.m.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
Yes. And then from 5:30 p.m. to 8:30 p.m., I was going to college Monday through Thursday. So I had a full load. So essentially I had 2 full-time jobs. And so that's when I started. That's when the light bulb came on. That's when I started to mature. I was like, oh man, I didn't realize that I was good at this and good at that and good because of my community. But being exposed to it while incarcerated, it actually saved my life. See, people ain't looking at it.
I know you want to jump in. I know you want to jump in, Morgan. I want to ask him one question, which is this though, Tyrone. You and I have talked about, second chances. And I've asked you because sometimes as advocates, especially professional advocates who haven't been in, they can also romanticize who's in prison. Not everybody there is somebody you want to have over and have coffee with. And so what I want to ask is, what was it that made you do that? Was that you? Did you see others do the same? Did you see others who said, I'm not even going to bother trying because I'm here? And do you think they would have responded differently if there had been incentives? You obviously self-started this process, but others maybe feel no hope. And so what could be done to make more people do what you did?
Well, it's the system. Like when you're convicted of a serious crime, like I was, twice a year, you'll hear it from government officials, which is your unit team, your unit manager, your case social worker, and your unit counselor that you're serving a life sentence. Twice a year, you hearing this. I don't need to tell anyone how debilitating that is. Why would I be thinking about being rehabilitated if government officials are telling me that I'm serving a life sentence as if I don't know that? I don't need to be reminded of that from you. Instead of like I had case managers who actually worked with me. Tyrone, you should get in this class. This class could help you. You should do this class. Then that changed. When I started going to team, you know what they would ask me? What classes are you taking because you took so much stuff? So when you have people come into your life, they should be there to help you, but in actuality, they're really pulling you down. If you don't have the right people in your life, and case management is one of them. We can talk, you know that, Kevin, even like you mentioned, the people there, that don't mean I want to have coffee with all of them standing at the microwave. It's the same way in your community. You don't talk with everybody in your community, and you're not going to have them all over for coffee. Being inside of the system is the same way.
Well, I just want to say this. I didn't want to say that in a pejorative way to mean that their lives don't have value and dignity and that they belong in prisons for the rest of their lives. All I mean is sometimes, some people could live a life of quiet dignity on the outside. We don't have to act as if they come out, they're going to be Bill Gates. It just means they're better off outside than inside, but it doesn't mean that everybody in there is a saint either. And I think sometimes in our advocacy, we try to paint too rosy a picture to overcome the negative stereotype. To your point about, sort of this debilitating thing, Morgan, I remember the first time my kids were on the phone call with me, and that interruption of, this call is from a federal prison. I mean, talk about just taking the wind out of your sails every single day. But you were going to say something else, but go ahead. It just made me think of that. Go ahead.
No, Kevin, you're right. I mean, not once, you get it 3 times. Like
I know.
You
Yeah.
get it 3 times.
Morgan,
Like
you're muted. Go ahead,
like
Morgan. Yeah, go ahead.
Morgan mentioned earlier some of the calls were $3.50, which is $3.45. Morgan, I remember when the call was $7.
Yeah.
It was $7 before advocates started saying, hey, it costs too much. And if you call collect, look for $20.
Yeah.
You know, and it's weird. Like, I come at it from a perspective of having listened to a number of jail calls, you know, from federal and state facilities, just in my doing, you know, work in criminal defense. And so it always just struck me as, I mean, I understand, of course, they record all these phone calls, and it always struck me as just a gross violation of someone's privacy, to that, you know, the government is, you know, recording all these phone calls. So yeah, I don't know, that's just struck me that you know, I just never really quite, I mean, I understand, I guess, the reasoning behind why, or at least why they say that they record those phone calls, but it always struck me as like overkill, and like, you don't really I don't know, have to do that. But that people, I don't know, we seem like we make it all the more difficult for people to have meaningful connections with their family, which supports them when they get, you know, back out on the outside.
I want to talk about families, because we got a question about that. But first, I want to ask you, Guy, because somebody asked, are you or were you ever on a registry?
Yeah, I am right now. You know, and the thing with so with registries, it's not based on like any assessment of risk. It's just, you commit this offense, therefore you go on a registry, and it doesn't particularly matter if you change, doesn't matter what happens in your life, and none of that matters. It's essentially another type of mandatory minimum, except it's not called quote unquote punishment. It's, you know, it's supposed to be done for the protection of the, you know, of the public, is the official rationale. So I am right now, and I mean, you can go and pull it up. Which, you know, people do from time to time, because I'm also very public. I'm very open and transparent about my past, and it's interesting because you know, people will occasionally have the misimpression that my offense was in 2018, because that was when my photo was last taken for the registry, because under state law I have to go back to probation and parole every 2 years, even though I've been off paper now for 10 years. But I have to go back to get a new picture taken, so it'll tell you what the photo date was, but it won't tell you on the registry page when my offense was. So for all anyone knows, it could have been yesterday, or it just says photo date 2018, so people assume it's 2018, and they don't know, it's 2006, it's 14 years ago. But yeah, so I have experienced personally death threats, vigilantism, being made homeless because of a registry, being threatened with eviction. You know, last summer my wife was fired from her job because of simply her being married to me. That was the only reason. Which of course then Sam swooped into the rescue. I have, you know, had to you know, explain to her daughter that I wasn't, because the state passed a law that said you can't go to any parks or playgrounds, and so I used to take her daughter to the playground to just do you know, the father figure thing, and I had to explain to her that I couldn't, you know, because I stopped doing that when they passed this law, and she thought I was mad at her, and that's why I wasn't taking her, or that I didn't take her to school because I was mad at her. And it wasn't mad at all. It was just that she was too young to understand all the various laws that I had to contend with. So yeah, I've had all those experiences, and I've been extremely fortunate also, because there are people with so many much worse experiences than I've had. I mean, there have been, people have been killed just for being on a registry. There have been people experiencing chronic homelessness, chronic joblessness. And I've been, like I said, just extremely, extremely, extremely fortunate. But anyway, that is.
Yeah, that's actually, we're getting close to the end, and I want to talk though about that issue for a second, which is the impact on families. That's one thing FAM,
Sure.
Really tries to, get across to lawmakers that there is a cost to be paid for innocent family members. The victim's innocent in all these offenses. There's no question about that. But there are other innocent parties whose value isn't counted the same. And it's hard to do that because you even hear people say, well, that was your fault then. If your kids are hurt by your offense and you being away, then that's on your ledger because you did that. It just doesn't seem like that's the answer. I mean, it just doesn't feel like that's a full answer there. And so I want to, go ahead.
Well, yeah, I mean, I was just going to say, like, there's certainly going to be people who think that there is no, that there is no punishment that is sufficient for me, that I should be, drained of my blood and put up on a pike or something like that. And you know what? I mean, I would, of course, respectfully disagree with that proposed course of action. But I know there are people who are going to be thinking that, and that's fine. But whatever you think about me, like, my family didn't do anything wrong. They didn't. I guess the only thing they did wrong was, like, be my family. But when it comes to, I know that when it comes to all aspects of the criminal legal system, families are in it with the person. And especially when it comes to, because again, like, the work that I do is with, sex offense registries and other types of public conviction registries, because it's, by the way, not just sex offenses anymore. They're continuing to roll it out for more and more types of offenses.
Right.
Everyone that lives at that address is also doing time, so to speak, on the registry, because it's the entire house is marked. So anyone that you live with, anyone that you're close to, is also, subject to experience the consequences right along with you. So you can punish me, like, I think that's fine, because I certainly committed a crime and I've never made any, I've always accepted responsibility for my actions, and I always will.
Yeah.
But they didn't do anything wrong.
Well,
So
let me ask Morgan about this, because one thing you mentioned was you were sent so far away because there wasn't a women's prison closer. Now, I don't know what the answer for that is, but I do think that's an issue that a lot of families have, which is that their loved ones are so far away. We tried to fix that at the federal level in the First Step Act, but there's so many loopholes that they can justify sending you further away because of programming needs or because your co-defendants are there. If you're running a prison system, I'm sorry, I put you in that position. What do you do to increase family connections and ties? Obviously, free phone calls. This is ridiculous that we're charging people, but, like, what else should we be thinking about?
The feds picked up my case because the state of Oregon would have given me probation, and they weren't okay with that. So that's why I went to federal prison. But, that didn't hurt me as much because I could afford those phone calls. And even my family all of my family flew down to visit me one time in the 2 years I was there. But the women, especially the Native American women that were coming off of reservations from North Dakota to California, of course they weren't getting visits. So how do we fix this? I think the federal system is uniquely broken in this aspect because it does send people so far away. So I'm not sure that after this change, if maybe some of those, like, Native American women are closer to home, but there are, like us from Oregon, our option is SeaTac, which is a detention center, or, Dublin, California. So, but the women's prison I was at, we had video visits, and those were very nice, but they were, you had to schedule them 4 days in advance. So, like, if anything happened in the interim, it's not like a FaceTime. It's not like, hey, let me just call you now. So there are lots of things that we could do to enhance family support and family connection, but especially free phone calls. I can't say it enough. My cell was right next to the phone, and so I just heard thousands of conversations of women calling their children, and they could only call 5 minutes once a week because that's all they could afford. And it was just heart-wrenching. So just keeping people closer to home, free phone calls, email credits, just lowering the barriers to maintaining social connection, because we know it is that social connection that reduces recidivism.
Yeah. Tyrone, I mean, you were probably consider yourself fortunate to be in Cumberland, because a lot of people in DC get sent all around the BOP around the country.
No, Kevin, I wasn't fortunate to be in Cumberland. I was not fortunate to be incarcerated, period.
Oh, stop. That's not what I mean.
But I mean, I did go to Cumberland the year they opened, 1995, right? And it could have been worse.
Yeah.
It could have been worse, but it turned out for my betterment, right? You know, I had, you know, and I'm listening to like the phone calls. Remember when I went in, the phone calls was astronomically high. And it was a time that there was no recording on the phone when I went in. When I went in, you had to go to the commissary to pay for phone credits. So you would call straight out. There was no recorder. You call straight out, you pick up the phone, people answer like hello, and people like, where you at? Like I'm in the Fed, I'm in the federal institution. Like I didn't hear recorder. Like, no, there is no recorder. When it was a prepaid call, there was no phone minutes either. So I was in a system during that time where there was no phone minutes. Like if you can pay, I mean, back then, I first got there, I was standing in line, a guy like put $1,500 on the phone. I was like, $1,500 on the phone. And he was saying this was on the Friday. He said by Monday, he'll need to put some more money on the phone because all the calls were, if you paying for them, it was $3.45, you paying for them. And you can just call, all day. All you had to do is get on the phone and just call. But some things transpired inside the system that caused that nation change.
Yeah.
And most people don't know that. But another thing, like I was the prison photographer.
Mm.
The things that I seen in the visiting room were mind-boggling. Like you have staff yelling at children, like families coming in. Then now they have this wand that they warn everybody that comes inside the prison. Some of these wands readings that people can touch explosives. And my first thought is, oh, you don't alert to the ATF when somebody has been in contact with explosive. Well, that's not our job. Well, why y'all warning people? People can stop and pump gas and their wand will show up positive for some type of drug or traces. So they need to stop turning people fat. And like you traveling 6 hours to see your loved one, but you get there and you turned around. You got these type of issues that's going on by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. Like, and this saying that we trying to make things better for you and your families, but those are the same people that you turn around doing visiting hours.
Yeah. Yeah. And that happens.
When they lock the prison down. When they lock the prison down, they don't tell you the prison is locked down.
Yeah.
We just had an interview with a young lady in our office right before this pandemic broke out. And she flew all the way to California to get out there in the prison on lockdown. It's things like that has to change.
Yeah. No, there's no doubt. And that does happen a lot in the state prisons as well. Listen, I want to wrap up and I want to talk about solutions. And before I do, I first want to say again that incredibly grateful to you all for sharing your stories and talking about this. What I really want people to come away from this is understanding to stop otherizing people. I just know that growing up and, I didn't know anybody who dealt drugs or did anything like that. So it was easy for me to just say, I can't possibly imagine what would make them do that. And once I could think that way, then it was easy for me to tolerate punishment for them because that's not something I did. But then I see people, who commit other types of offenses that are understandable to me, and others say, I don't even know how you could do that. And the whole point of it is to expand your sort of circle of compassion beyond what you know. It's easy to forgive people you know and love. The point of this, though, is to understand that other people do things that maybe you don't understand. And there are reasons, and it's just because you have a different experience. So I want to talk a little bit about solutions or a way forward, maybe one or two things that you think could make a difference. And also, Guy, I'm going to start with you because we had a request for sharing a website or something that people who are going through similar experiences might go for resources or help. So if you could start with that and then we'll go around.
Geez. I mean, people who are going through similar experiences, are certainly feel free to reach out to me. You can contact me. I have a website. It's just guyhamiltonsmith.com, where you can contact me there. I'm also on Twitter, and I'll be happy to talk with anyone, offline and try to help them out. Because and I think Sam has a really good explainer on the sentencing end of child pornography offenses. With the registry related issues, there are a number of organizations around the country that are involved in advocacy efforts and reform efforts. So I mean, what type of resources is this person looking for? Do you know, like more specifically?
Oh, I don't know.
Oh, okay. Well, then I mean, yeah, people can certainly reach out to me, and I'll be happy to try to connect them with resources, in any way that I possibly can.
All right. Well, now cheer us up with something that you can decree one reform. Are you abolishing registries? What are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, I'm abolishing registries, because I mean, if registries, and I'm happy to talk. I can go on about this, but I'll just say that I mean, sex offense registries perpetuate sexual violence, and they do that in a number of different ways. And so, if we care about preventing sexual violence, then we should get rid of things that are harmful to that end. And registries are harmful to that end, so we should get rid of them. And there was a time when we didn't have them. I mean, it's not really that radical, and it wasn't that long ago. I understand that, these are very difficult things to talk about. They're very difficult things to think about. But that's what all the data support. And so yeah, if I could make one change when it comes to registries, get rid of them, do something useful with all that money and all that manpower. Yeah.
All right, I hear you. Morgan, you're up.
So this isn't actually replicable, but my biggest, I grew up white and middle class. I didn't know anybody that did drugs or went to jail. And so my biggest transformational experience was sitting in prison and talking to people that were there for bank robbery, that were there for murder. And because, we're taught to just put these labels that supplant their identity. Oh, murderer, bank robber. But no, that was my cellie. So we just got to sit and chop it up for, months. And then I just see their humanity. And then what I started to notice was patterns in people's childhood. Okay, so A plus B equals C. So when you have sexual trauma plus poverty, that equals prison, typically. And especially in a women's prison, that was the sort of formula that I saw. So, my magic wand is going to be, huge investment in communities, lifting people out of poverty, early childhood education, reducing exposure to adverse childhood experiences, because then we're reducing the demand for drugs, because people are treating their emotional pain with drug use. And just like widespread drug decriminalization because handcuffs is not the answer, it really just makes it worse.
Yeah, I wanted to say something because the time is, I always think somebody's always the boogeyman. Like I said, it was crack offenses and it was sex offenses. And I just want to say something very controversial, which is the guy across from me in my bunk was a police officer, and he kept his identity hidden because if anyone knew, right, he was a police officer. And I just think, even now, I mean, who wants to be the police officer who screws up? And where's the grace for that person? Because behind the shield, behind the badge, behind a corrupt system, there's an individual who took that job for reasons we don't know and maybe made bad choices. But it just, the pig pile always finds somebody else. And so I'm always interested in thinking, who do we hate the most? And can I find compassion for that person? And right now, I would hate to be the cop who screwed up. And this guy who I served time with, I remember when it finally got out, it came out because somebody Googled, called home and they Google searched him, and they said, "Oh, Kevin, what do you think? John is was a dirty cop." And I said, "Well, you're a dirty drug dealer and I'm a dirty lobbyist. I mean, what are we judging him for?" It just felt incredibly insane that we would do that. But even there was this idea that we're going to have some hierarchy of wrongs. And I just thought it was interesting. Let me go to you, Tyrone. I know you're already working on reform. Wave a magic wand, fix the system. What do you do?
Second chance for everyone.
Yeah.
Second chance because especially on the deep end, we don't, it's not palatable to talk about violent offenses, right? And serious crimes or serious offenses and having reform for that, let alone a second change. Right? If we don't deal with that, we're going to continue to talk about mass incarceration because the system is going to constantly be backed up with all these people who are not coming in and out of the system. But the low-hanging fruit comes in and out of the system. You mentioned recidivism, and I always wondered who is, what's the driving cause to keeping that number up, right? The number always staying up. It's never going down, right? And, and actually, what is recidivism? Because I've actually seen people come in the system or come back into the system for something that don't even exist. The guy parole officer locked him up and said, you got a new charge in another state. He's like, man, I was at work and here's the record for that. And then they come back and say, yeah, no, that wasn't him. Do they count that as recidivism?
Yeah.
So, you're wondering, like, what are these numbers? Who, what's the driving factor behind these numbers and why they keeping it so high? But I would like to see a second chance for everyone because you got so many people that's serving so much time. I was there for 24 years, 8 months and 15 days. I know what that's like to be around people constantly. And when you're in certain institutions like a Maximum, which is a penitentiary, people don't change cells. They just started changing that, whereas though you have to move from one cell to the next. At first, people be in the same cell for 5, 7, 8, 9, 10 years at a time before they leave that prison. So like you want to see a change, and who is to say that those people are not rehabilitated if we don't give them a chance? One thing I noticed that people who commit harm, victims change, and so-called perpetrators change, or people who commit harm change. And the system needs to be building some platform so these people can come together and mend those ways. If not, you keep them separated, those feelings are never resolved. As soon as they hear this person's name or they see an image of this person, here come those raw feelings that has never been resolved. They come back up to the surface. And here it is, I feel the same way. No, like the system needs to change. We need to overhaul the system. We need to create better laws and just give people a chance.
Well, you stole my answer. I was going to say same thing. I mean, we're working on this together. You're living proof of the need for second chances. I do think it's hard to convince people on the front end that we don't have to lock people up and throw them away forever. But if we could at least leave the opportunity, we're not saying everyone should get out. We're saying we shouldn't throw everyone away. And so we need mechanisms in the system for prosecutors, judges, to revisit long sentences. So when somebody has served time and they're ready to come out, we can make that possible. And so a lot of that has to deal with eliminating mandatory sentences too. So with that, I just want to thank you all again. I want to thank everybody who hung in with us. We went longer than usual, but I could have spoke all day with these folks. And so thanks to Morgan and to Guy and to Tyrone. And we'll see you next week. Thanks, everybody.